Content note. The following episode contains mentions of abuse, sexual predators, and murder. Hey everybody, it's Connor Renfroe here, co-host of the From the Margins podcast, introducing the pilot episode of my own series, RenFare, where I will be discussing my own media interests and providing my unique criticisms and hot takes. For this first episode, I'm trying out reading off some liner notes. I don't like to do scripted content because my voice is already kind of mechanical. I didn't want to sound like a total robot. So I have my little notes here and I'm going to try to follow them in a natural progression. And if that doesn't work out, I'm just going to start scripting my content. Maybe I'll get better in time. Please bear with me in these early steps. I like to do unscripted content because, I feel more organic and natural when I can look at the prompts and the cues I provided myself and be like, oh yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And it feels more confessional. It feels more authentic. I've mentioned this in the podcast, in the From the Margins official podcast before. I'm actually a patient in psychoanalysis, which is different from therapy in that it's, I'm lying on the couch 3 times a week, just saying what's on my mind for 45 minutes at a time, and my analyst mostly listens to me, sometimes helps me see the through line in the stories I'm telling. And that's the kind of feel I want to achieve here as well, where I'm just talking, musing, sharing my thoughts on these pieces of media and cultural criticism, and maybe I'll even have like light bulb moments, and you can't really have those if you're reading off a script anyway. Speaking of psychoanalysis, mostly the psycho part, I wanted to begin by talking about the Netflix sensation You. Right, I know. So relevant right now. As of time of recording, the second season has been out for a couple weeks, and I'm pretty sure it's been talked to death. It's pretty popular. I feel like in the future, a lot of my content will veer towards things that aren't as talked about. My interests are pretty unique, I feel. But I just have so many feelings about this series, and the more content I view on it, the less satisfied I am. I feel like there's a lot of meta-narratives around the show being espoused that I don't necessarily agree with. I want to challenge a few of them, and I also want to affirm the things I did agree with. And I also just want to talk about it with somebody because most of the people in my life are not watching it, or they're watching it and not appreciating it in the same way I am. Maybe they hate it because it's too creepy, which is understandable, or maybe they love it for what I feel are all the wrong reasons. Yeah, I'm very judgmental. But no, that's what we're going to be talking about today is You. So as a little introduction, I just want to say, spoilers for the first 2 seasons, naturally. I do want to acknowledge that Caroline Kepnes is the author of the book series upon which the TV show is based. I have not read her books. I consider myself an avid reader. If you listen to episodes of From the Margins, you will know that Violet and I talk about books occasionally. There's a forthcoming episode at time of recording that I'm really proud of where we just talk about suspense thrillers, domestic thrillers, and that discussion really inspired me to talk about this Netflix series. I do want to say that I have not read the books. I have looked into where the TV show has deviated from the book. I wanted to make sure I had at least a grasp on the full story before I made any kind of overarching claims about it. I also want to say that in this talk, I will not be diagnosing the character of Joe Goldberg. I am not an expert in psychopathy or sociopathy. I also feel like giving him an official diagnosis takes away from the power of the character, which comes from relating to him, seeing where the two of you as the viewer and he as the character are not quite so different. A huge attracting factor of the show for me was like through Joe, I had to confront my own shadow in some ways. If you're familiar with Jungian psychoanalytical criticism, you know that the shadow represents the part of the unconscious mind where all of the parts you hate about yourself are manifested. Your shadow is that part of you that you don't like. And when you hate somebody and you don't really understand why, sometimes you realize that like they remind you of yourself. And that is you projecting your shadow onto them. That's definitely true for me. I've encountered a lot of people I've not been very fond of. And when I think about it deeply, I'm like, oh yeah, all those traits that annoy me about them, I also see in myself. And those are the parts of me I don't like. I'm projecting my shadow onto them. I'm thinking these are qualities that I've deemed unlovable in myself, and I do not love them in others as well. And that's what Joe represents to me. I relate to Joe Goldberg. I know. That's not something you're really supposed to admit. I assume if you've clicked onto this, you probably have some familiarity with any of the properties. He is a killer. He is an obsessive stalker. By the end of season 2, he has a very large body count. And strangely enough, a lot of people watching the show are still fascinated by him. They find themselves rooting for him. I think that's very interesting. I myself kind of just want him to get caught. Like, as much as I enjoy the show, I'm like, how much higher can the stakes be raised? I'm stressed out. I'm literally rooting for him to get caught just so that, like, there can be some kind of ending, some closure. I hate being left with this stress. But I do relate to Joe. I remember being in middle and high school and operating on many of the same wavelengths he did, or he does. A lot of that power comes from the justifying narratives he tells himself. In season 1, he fixates on this girl, Guinevere Beck, and he is convinced he's in love with her. He stalks her. He starts manipulating aspects of her life. He kills her boyfriend, inserts himself as her new boyfriend, alienates her from her friends, kills her friends. It's a mess. You cannot tear your eyes away from it. And he does this because he believes he's in a love story. He loves Beck. He would do anything for Beck. And these are the narratives that he uses to justify himself. Narrative is an important tool in psychoanalysis. If you're well versed in the humanities, you kind of understand that humans operate through story. We view our lives sequentially. We talk about whenever like a major thing happens and we have to start something new, we call it starting a new chapter. And whenever we're leaving something, we call it closing out that chapter, starting a new book. Whatever. Story is powerful, and Joe believes he's in a love story with Beck. And that justifying narrative is what propels him in all of his very bad decisions. I did kind of a deep dive into cast interviews because I wanted to know what was already being said. And I was pleasantly surprised that the cast and the writers had very similar ideas to me. This is me watching these interviews recently. Like, I watched season 1 last year when it first came to Netflix. I did not catch its original run on Lifetime. I am a fake fan. I'm just part of the hype train, really. But no, I watched these like almost 2-year-old interviews with the cast, and I found them all saying things that I was picking up on and new things that I didn't really appreciate at the time. Like, our culture and our media have conditioned us to accept inappropriate tropes as part of a love story. I watched a lot of YouTube videos lately about how these like 80s and 90s iconic rom-coms actually feature male stalkers. I think the most popular example is You've Got Mail, where the male lead forces himself into the woman's room while she's repeatedly saying no, and like basically forces her to go to dinner with him or on a date with him. That's portrayed as quirky and cute and what needed to happen for their love to blossom. And this show, what a terrible name to talk about. The Netflix original series You, not to be confused with You, the viewer, or any kind of second person hypothetical. Anyway, the Netflix series You is kind of the shadow, the logical progression of these rom-com tropes. I was viewing the show purely psychoanalytically. I didn't even think about the effect of culture. And I'm like, well, of course, culture affects the psyche. The way you're acculturated and the culture you are raised in informs your narrative. And the character of Joe, he is brought up to believe that you do anything for love, and that everything he does to Beck, he's actually doing for Beck. You know, he thinks her friends are holding her back, he eliminates them. He thinks her first boyfriend is a load of crap, he eliminates him. And it's all in the service of making her a better person. And I'll take this moment to say I also relate to Beck. You know, she has some darkness, she has some depth to her. I understand that her portrayal in the book is a lot more naive, a lot more passive. The events are actually happening more to her. She's a passive victim to a lot of it. In the show, which is the only form of the story I'm familiar with, she has an active part in it, and you see a little bit of her own darkness, her own feelings of inadequacy, and this like dark drive to better herself. I really did. Elizabeth Lale, the actress who plays Guinevere Beck in season 1 and in season 2, she appears in season 2. She said in an interview that she believes that Beck and Joe are really soulmates, and I kind of agree with that. I'm not saying they're good for each other. I'm not in any way condoning this awful relationship, but I really did get the sense that Beck is the perfect victim to Joe. She is self-obsessed, and the form of love she is most able to receive is likewise unhealthy obsession from a partner, right? She's looking for external validation that she is worthy. She had her own like daddy issues, and the obsessive, fixated love that Joe provided is what her damaged mind was willing to accept as normal and healthy and what she deserves. Yeah. So on that note, let's just dive into Beck finds out that Joe has been stalking her, that he's killed her boyfriend and her best friend, and he's been covering it all up. And I think she like tries to confront him, which is stupid. She should have just run away. First of all, Beck makes a lot of mistakes, especially in the end. And he ends up imprisoning her in the basement of his bookstore in this glass cage. Beck, in an attempt to escape, pretends to fall in love with him. She pretends to see it from his point of view, and she even writes this book. You know, she's a aspiring writer, and a lot of what Joe does in the series is to prompt her to write better material. He's actually making her life more exciting, so she has stuff to write about. It's great. As an aspiring writer myself, I'm fascinated by this dynamic, and we'll get into that deeper in just a second. She writes this book, which is literally a justifying narrative for Joe. She blames all of the deaths in her life on her therapist, and she basically crafts Joe's alibi for him while also claiming that, you know, she's in love with him. She sees the light, she sees his side, and she's willing to love him. He's so happy, he lets his guard down, and she hits him with something. She like knocks him down and tries to escape, but he's locked the door behind him, so she's trapped in there, and then he like grabs her from behind and strangles her. And I'm like, Beck, you can't just knock him unconscious and continue to run. This is like what happens in every horror movie. When you have the upper hand, you have to go all the way. You have to kill the person imprisoning you. You can't just knock them out and continue to run. You have to kill them while you have the upper hand. I digress. Yeah, Joe kills her. And that's the end of season 1. And I was very disappointed by that ending. It was very cliched, I felt. I talk about this with Violet in episode 4 of our podcast. It has yet to air as of time of recording, but In all these domestic thrillers, it's always the same. The girl is already dead, the missing girl is already dead, or she's going to die. I understand that this TV show was based on a book, and the sequel to that book had already been released. And if they wanted to be faithful to that source material, they had to, end it in much the same way. Joe has to kill Beck, and he has to find motivation to leave. And I'm very disappointed in that. I'm thinking, if she was going to die anyway, then why did you add all of this fluff to it? I do know that the TV show added significant side plots and characters to make Joe more sympathetic and give Beck more to do, give her friends more to do, create more compelling plot lines. But if she's going to die anyway, why even bother? Just make it a movie, make it a 2-hour movie. She's going to die anyway. That's how I felt about it. I felt like a TV show would have a much more interesting conclusion where Beck isn't pretending to have fallen in love with Joe. She's actually, descended into her own darkness. She thinks to herself, I don't really love Joe as much as he loves me. I'm really put off by his stalking and his serial killing. But damn, if he does not make my life interesting. Like, because of his actions, and because of how I report those actions, I have a book deal. I'm finally getting my writing career started. Why don't I just stick this out, stay with this killer, and he can keep my life interesting. I can keep writing, and it doesn't even have to be love. Joe can continue to be fixated and in love with her, and she can just tolerate it and profit off of it even. That would be a much more compelling television show. And of course, season 2 would be a completely different story. It would deviate from the book, of course. It wouldn't really work out long term. Yeah. So that's my alternate ending to season 1. And I will say, after finishing season 2, which I recently did, I feel a little vindicated. Season 2 of the show kind of took a page from my book. Joe goes to LA to escape his first ex, Candace, whom he thought he had killed, but she comes back because she survived the murder attempt. The accidental murder attempt, and she just has this plan to ruin his life, and she sucks at following through. The stakes really don't make any sense to me, but it's fun to watch, so I don't judge it too hard. This is not the purpose of this podcast episode. Candace comes back, Joe flees to LA, and he encounters Love Quinn and her twin brother 40. Naming the new female love interest Love is so on the nose, and yet the psychoanalyst in me adores it, of course. She is an archetypal figure. She is not a human being. Joe is incapable of actually being in love. He can only fixate on people, and he's truly fixated on the idea of love, of romance. This woman will never be a human to him. She will only be love. So that's fun. That's neat. I don't really know the significance of her twin being named 40. I guess that's some weird California thing going on. The parents are kind of new age Gwyneth Paltrow types. So, or at least their mom is. The dad is probably just funding whatever his young wife is into at the moment. He's an absentee father. Both parents are absentee. These twins have a lot of trauma, just like Joe does. I do want to talk about 40. Just like Beck, he's an aspiring writer, but because he's in LA, he wants to be a screenwriter. He wants to have a feature film. Joe is so desperate to attract Love's attention and be part of her life. He sees that these twins are really weirdly connected to each other. That is I can't be a part of Love's love life. I can't be in Love's life unless I am part of 40's life. So he joins in 40's quest to write the movie adaptation of Guinevere Beck's memoir, which was posthumously published. That's the funny thing I did from the end of season 1, because Beck had written that book for Joe, and he kills her, but he still gets the book published. And Candace, the scorned ex who Joe tried to kill earlier, approaches 40 under the assumed name Amy Adam. And she's like, this book is so hot. Let's adapt it into a movie. This is part of my weird way of torturing Joe. Like, we're going to make him adapt the woman he murdered's autobiography into a movie. Great. Fabulous. What could go wrong? I mean, it is established that Candace does not have a killer instinct herself. She's unable to kill Joe. I guess she's a little too human. 40 kind of falls in love with Candace, but I found myself kind of shipping 40 and Joe with each other. Like, there was some major homosocial energy there. There's even an episode where they get high on LSD, and 40 is like mad hitting on Joe, like, would you fuck me? Tell me honestly, bro. Would you fuck me? I'd fuck you. And I'm like, all right, the mask comes off. 40 is gay for Joe. And maybe it's like a weird thing, like 40 is actually in love with his twin sister, Love, and Love is in love with Joe. So 40 is also in love with Joe. I don't know. Joe, of course, does not reciprocate. He only has eyes for Love. He's just like incapable of true human connection in the first place. So, yeah. I mentioned that 40 and Love are codependent. That's not me diagnosing them. That's like an established dynamic between the two. You know, I like it. I love like the two close sibling dynamic. I think it's interesting. I think it's fun. And I kind of like the idea that maybe 40 is a little in love with his sister, because the whole thrust of the show is that these are humans who are unable to connect with each other in a real way. They don't know what real love is. Love thinks that Love, much like Joe, is doing whatever it takes to protect the people who are dependent on you. When they were kids, 40 was being molested by their au pair. Love straight up slits the au pair's throat while 40 is unconscious, and then puts the razor in 40's hand, so he believes that he blacked out and did it himself. Then there's the twist. Joe desperately wants to be a better person. He wants to leave his life of crime behind. And yet, early in the season, he kind of accidentally kills a child predator. His landlord, Delilah, whom he was sleeping with. Because there's like a period where he and Love break up. And he starts sleeping with Delilah. And Delilah cracks the case. She finds that Joe has transported his little glass box out of the basement of his bookstore into a storage unit in LA. I don't know why Joe brought the glass box with him. I guess it serves his little purposes. If you watch the show, you know what I'm talking about. I just want to get into it because this is already running long. She finds that glass box. She finds evidence that he killed the child predator. Joe locks her in there in the box because he comes in behind her because she was also too stupid to like keep tabs on his location before she broke into his glass box and started like uncovering murder evidence. So he just leaves her in there and he's like, don't worry, I put some like time release handcuffs on you. I'm gonna leave town. I want to be a better person. I'm not gonna kill you. Then he goes out, and then Love, who had been following him, finds Delilah, and she's like, plot twist, I'm just as crazy as Joe and I'm in love with him and I'm not gonna let you compromise our relationship. So she kills Delilah, and then she kills Candace, and so now her body count has quickly risen up. It's not as high as Joe's, but like in the period of one episode, she's like almost on par with him. If he killed 2 people in season 2, she kills 2 people in season 2, so at least for that season, they're equal. And then she's killed 1 other person in the past, and he's killed like 4 or 5 as far as we know. So she's not like, she doesn't have the same body count, but like what's weird is Joe has had some kind of weird character development, and he starts to feel contrition for his actions, and Love confronts him with his own shadow, his own dark side. And she's like, I would do anything for Love. You know, all of the same justifying narratives he's been feeding the audience throughout these 2 seasons. She's giving it to him. At first, I was excited. I'm sitting there with my box of pizza and my soda, and I'm like, finally, some good fucking content. Like, this is what I wanted season 1 to be. And then very quickly, I'm just disappointed because Joe's not into it. He actually was invested in being a better person. Womp womp. love, because Joe can't see her as a human being after what she's done. The audience is no longer able to see her as a human being. Like, I think that was actually kind of brilliant in the framing of it. We kind of fall in love with all of Joe's love interests as well. And that's the power of, like, the male gaze, the story being told through his eyes. Like, we fall in love with Beck. We fall in love with Love. She even tells him, though, it's like, you never saw me as a person. You saw what you wanted to see. This is who I really am. And as an audience member, just like Joe, I also find myself repulsed by her. Not because of her actions, but because of, like, what her character turns into. Like, she's suddenly so cold and calculating and grumpy and sad, and it's not the same compelling thing. Like, I really just wanted my two serial killers to be together. I don't know. I wanted, like, and I understand that's not the story the show is interested in telling. It wants to show, you know, the dark side of obsession, fixation, and not being able to truly see the other person. And I'm looking for maybe, like, a real twisted love story, a dark love story. Two broken people who are using each other under the guise of love. Anyway, Joe pulls a Beck on Love and tricks her into thinking he's on her side, and then he tries to kill her, and she's like, no, don't do it, I'm pregnant. And it's like, uh-oh. And Joe is suddenly like, I'm gonna be a father. And that's when we find out about a lot of his past issues. He's suddenly very invested in the idea of being a father. He wants to repair the relationship he did not have with his parents by being a good parent to his daughter. They somehow already know it's going to be a girl. And so he wants to be the best father he can be to Love's baby, ostensibly his baby. I wanted to tweet this out, but I didn't, but I'm going to say it here. I think it's not his baby. This is really disgusting, but I'm like, it's probably 40's baby. The twins were probably fucking. That's exactly the kind of, like, twisted Game of Thrones shit that I believe a Netflix original series would pull just to be cringy and edgy. It doesn't really matter because a few minutes later, 40 is killed by Delilah's lover, a cop, and I think they, like, pin all of the murders on 40. Luckily for Joe, the Quinn parents, they have deep ties to the LAPD. They make all of the crimes go away. Our two little serial killers can raise their baby together in the suburbs. I don't really know what the setting changes for season 3. I don't know if they stayed in California. I kind of got Miami vibes. I'm going to go ahead and guess that, like, I think season 3 might take place in Miami. I don't know. I feel like each one is in a different major city. So New York, Los Angeles, now Miami. Let's wrap up by talking about trauma. Everybody's favorite thing, right? That is what our culture is having a huge reckoning with, to my view, is like the effects of trauma on us and our ability to connect with other people. And I feel like that is wonderfully shown in this TV series. Maybe not wonderfully, maybe not truly effectively. I know a lot of people have, like, sick ideas that Joe Goldberg is, like, actually dreamy and actually boyfriend goals and he can do no wrong, and yeah, he's a bit of a stalker and an obsessive and a murderer, but, like, he loves her. I don't know. Maybe that's a small minority that gets an unusually large platform because of, like, how cringy they are. But I said in the beginning that I was not interested in diagnosing Joe as a psychopath, and I think he's a lot more compelling as just a normal dude. Penn Badgley, the actor who portrays Joe, mentioned in an interview that throughout Joe's childhood, he internalized a lot of bad messages from the culture about, like, anything is acceptable for love. Because of this, Joe drew the wrong conclusions about what is acceptable behavior, what humans are allowed to do to each other. And he had no one around to correct him. And this was an interview given before season 1 even, like, aired in its entirety. And after season 2, we can see how correct he was in that assessment. In season 1, we get a lot of flashbacks to Joe's, like, auxiliary father figure. Maybe like a foster dad. It's been a while since I watched it. I didn't go back and review it because I'm an irresponsible critic. But at least in his late adolescence, he had a father figure in his boss, Mooney, who is the owner of the bookstore Joe works in the first season. In the TV show, we see flashbacks of a young adult Joe getting locked in that glass case because he would make mistakes. And Mooney tells him, like, I do this because I love you. And when people do wrong things, we have to punish them so they become better. And that becomes a bit of a justifying narrative for Joe. He loves Beck, so he locks her away and manipulates her environment. Whenever people do bad things, he punishes them. The show, or at least Joe in his little internal monologue that narrates the show, does a lot to tell us, does a lot to justify his actions. It tells us that everybody he kills deserves it. Beck's boyfriend at the start of the show, Joe ends up killing him, but not just because he stands between him and Beck. Joe digs into his past and finds evidence that this boyfriend was responsible for one of his friend's death in a hazing incident. And he's like, oh yeah, you killed somebody, now you have to die. I think Joe would have found some reason to kill him regardless, right? But it says a lot that he went through and had to find a reason to do it, so that it wasn't just cold-blooded murder, it was a justified extrajudicial slaying. Or Joe sees himself as the judge. In season 2, we get flashbacks to child Joe growing up with his parents. His father abuses his mom. His mom does a lot of running around with other men. You see the mom through Joe's eyes. So, in 2 scenes, she abandons him in public to run off and sleep with some strange man, which is terrible. But you also get the idea that she's doing that because she's trying to get an escape plan from her husband. Not the best way to go about it. You don't just abandon your child on the pier or at a supermarket, right? Because Joe loves his mom and because he can't find any fault in her, she's portrayed, I believe, a little more sympathetically than she deserves. Everything she does is also justified, which ties into Joe's need to justify his actions. So he has mommy issues. His dad is abusive. Joe ends up shooting his dad to protect his mom from a beating at one point. It was probably a justified slaying. His dad was a piece of shit. He was going to kill his mom. Joe had a gun. He shot his dad. And then his mom, in an effort to, mitigate the mental scarring of slaying your own father. Oh, wow, Oedipus complex. Thanks, Freud. In order to, mitigate that mental scarring, she says, you were protecting me. You did it for love. And that goes on to become his justifying narrative throughout the rest of the series. That's all I had to say. I really enjoy the show. As a review, I will say that I'm always more interested in the side characters and their dramas than I am with Joe himself. Season 2, I felt, storytelling-wise, was a lot better because all of those side plots were interconnected. He worked at Love's Deli bookstore with 40, and his tenant, she was a past victim of the child predator comedian guy who was also 40's friend because 40's trying to enter the showbiz scene. It was all connected very well. It was crafted well. And then that Candace subplot only added frustration, but at least, it kept the tension up. I don't remember season 1 very well, but I thought it was cute and charming. If not for the ending, I would have loved it. So, that's it. That was RenFare. Thanks for listening. Bye.